Now, that middle line is probably going to be the most significant because there is an additional MP from the opposition today who has announced they will be supporting the budget, and that is Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Take a listen.
I'm going to vote yes for the country, for the planet, and for my hope in the future. The Liberals can't count on me voting confidence in the government again without delivering on the words I heard.
All right, we've got a ton to unpack there, and who better to do that than a special edition of the Strategy Session. Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Corey Tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Hi, everyone, on this Monday. Scott, I'll start with you. Elizabeth May says there's enough in this now, enough from the Prime Minister today that she can support the budget, which means we're just a few abstentions away from it going ahead. If you were to put some money on it, what would you guess happens?
Like, I'd bet all of Corey's money, and that's no small sum, that the budget will pass. We might get the full thrill of a tied vote. I mean, the NDP, if they do a couple of abstentions, they may be so strategic, they may do it so precisely that they might literally take this to a tie. Then the Speaker would have to bust the tie and continue the Parliament. So I think it's going to be dramatic. I think it's going to be fun to watch. But I think ultimately the budget's going to pass. Parliament will live. We will not be subjected to a Christmas election. And fun fact, although it can't happen by law, if the Prime Minister was to call an election on Wednesday, technically 37 days would be Christmas Day. What better way to celebrate your friends and family than by casting a ballot?
It's what we all are asking Santa for, I'm sure.
No.
Corey, what does your gut tell you about how this plays out?
I think there'll be some abstentions, and we won't have an election campaign. That's my guess. But boy, no, this isn't as exciting as the Grey Cup game yesterday because we don't fully know how it's going to turn out. I think that's the most likely outcome. But you know, the last time we were through something like this with the Clark government, everyone in Ottawa thought the budget was going to pass, and then it didn't. So, you know, surprises are a surprise because you don't see them coming. So, you know, I will be watching anxiously when the vote occurs.
Yeah, it's a good warning, Kathleen, because I think we have a sense of where things could go, but Corey's absolutely right. You do never know. When you are in a minority position, you do need additional support or a certain number of abstentions. Now with Elizabeth May kind of outlining what she is going to do, I think attention necessarily shifts to the NDP. What are you going to be watching for?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of attention on the NDP because a lot of the framing around this budget vote, the story has been that the NDP is leaderless, dollarless, and can't afford to go into an election. But actually, I think there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, a lot more horse trading that's happening among all the parties. And it's not clear to me even if the Conservatives actually will all, in fact, show up and vote against this budget. And their abstentions could mean that New Democrats could full-throatedly vote against this budget. You know, listen, it has been known and characterized as sometimes a mercurial caucus at times, and there is an eagerness of New Democrats to vote against Carney's, cuts that he's making and the lack of investment in certain areas, and certainly the job cuts that are coming to the public service, among other things. But there have been things put on the table that are also attractive to New Democrats. But I think what I'm watching for the most, Vashi, is how the leaders, whether it's Pierre Poilievre, whether it's Don Davies, or even how we heard Elizabeth May earlier in the day, frame up their decision. And I think that, Elizabeth May basically got her vote bought by the Carney Liberals today for the privilege of asking one question in the House of Commons and getting some vague commitments to the Paris objectives, that they'll try harder. I think that if you're going to actually vote for this budget, you should eke out real measures from this Carney government. And if you don't get those new measures, I think it's fair to abstain because most Canadians don't want an election right now. So it's fair to say, hey, we're going to let this one go. We don't like the budget, but we're not going to vote actively against it because nobody wants, except Scott Reid, to have a Christmas election.
What position in that vein, Scott, our number one champion of a Christmas election, what position do you think is most tenable to Canadians? Because I know we always look at it from a strategic perspective, but ultimately, I think Canadians are fairly tuned in right now to what's happening as well.
To a degree, but I think Canadians would be shocked, as we all would be, if this thing went sideways. And Corey's right. Weird things can happen. I mean, if you're literally counting it down to a tie, somebody falls on a stapler or something, you can get a crazy outcome. But I don't think Canadians expect an election. I don't actually think they're glued to their television watching this count. So if there was to be an election, I think there would be a large expression of outrage across the country. And that's really why Liz May is saying, despite almost nothing in this budget being in concert with where she would want federal public policy going, she's saying, look, ask me. I get one question, I get whatever, I get a free Snickers bar, like whatever it takes, because she knows the Canadians don't want an election, and that's ultimately why this budget will pass. Nobody wants to pull the trigger on this and be blamed for doing so.
It's interesting because in the lead up, Corey, like especially over the last week, you've heard parties talk less and less about the prospect of an election. Like there has not been an overabundance of pre-positioning. When it comes to the Conservatives, obviously, and we've talked about this on a couple of occasions, this whole budget vote process has happened in concert with some, big events for them as well. Do you think it matters if Matt Genereux abstains from tonight's vote?
Well, it could matter, right? So the Liberals have gained 2 votes, Elizabeth May and D'Outremont. So you're talking about like a party of 6 people for the NDP. One, if you assume that the contestant running for leadership of the party is going to vote against, and the person who's the interim leader is going to vote against, you basically need 50% of the remaining part of their caucus to abstain in order to get there. And I heard what Kathleen said about, getting something concrete. Well, how well did that work for the NDP during the Trudeau years? I would say it worked pretty disastrously badly for them. And so I could see if I were a part of that caucus, I would be, wondering what exactly has to be in that budget to have me vote for it, and think that that's going to save my bacon when it comes to going to the electorate. It's probably easier, just given the size of their caucus, for the Conservatives to have some people to abstain, because it's such a tiny percentage of what their actual caucus is. It's probably easier to play that off. But, I haven't seen a lot of signs of the Conservatives not wanting an election. I've seen kind of a lot of the opposite. I think, if they could go back in time and relitigate the last one again, I think they would, if you look at what their positioning has been. So, it still feels like this is more of an act of faith as to what's going to happen on this vote than it is, anyone having counted noses and having certainty about it.
Yeah, it doesn't feel certain. That's a good point. Kathleen, what do you think about what Corey just said?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, I won't debate at length, but I'll argue with Corey anytime about the impact that Democrats made in terms of, establishing the dental care program and childcare, you name it. I can go on at length. But I'll put that aside and actually go back to the question you asked him, and I'll answer it directly. What difference will it make if Matt Genereux actually abstains? They only need 2 abstentions for the budget to pass now with Elizabeth May's pro vote. So, but symbolically, so whether it means a lot or not if Genereux is one of the 2 abstainers, it does matter a lot symbolically to the Conservatives, because then it does show, even though he, according to Pierre Poilievre, is still part of the Conservative caucus, he's not willing to vote along caucus lines. Conversely, if he does vote with the Conservatives, there's more strength, frankly, to Pierre Poilievre's comments that he's staying within a caucus. So I would watch for the Genereux vote where that goes. Also, any other Conservatives that don't happen to show up or abstain from that vote. Equally, you could look at the Liberals, where they're falling. I think Nate Erskine-Smith will in fact vote for the Liberal budget, but will they all vote? Yes, that's something to look for. And just lastly, to comment to Scott's point, I would just say it's about the framing. And the problem is that no, Scott, Elizabeth May said she's voting in favor of this budget because she got a promise from Prime Minister Carney to meet the Paris objectives. He just said he's going to try hard. She's getting literally nothing. So a better framing of why you're voting, either abstaining or voting, for this budget potentially, is because in fact you don't want Canadians to be thrust into a Christmas election. That's foolish. That is not the time. In fact, Stephen Harper did the same thing in 2005 when he had the largest all-caucus abstention, of 98 of his members in 2005. So there's precedent for this. Other people have done this when we don't want to trigger an election right now.
But they're
Scott,
saying
who
they
appear
won't,
less bothered.
right? but no one's saying they're going to do that. I guess that's the difference. If you want to go back to 2005, there's clearly a decision by the Conservatives at the time to have not just an abstention but a massive abstention.
A whipped abstention.
So
I remember May 19th, 2005. When there was a tied vote and the speaker had to break the tie. It was white knuckle time. So, it wasn't like they just said, hey, man, it's a free pass for you liberals.
Right. Well, it's going to be high drama.
Tune in.
It will be. Thank you. So I counter to what Scott said. Everyone will be tuning in, including our. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the analysis. As I'm teasing, I appreciate the analysis as always. Our Sunday strats, especially with us for Monday. Scott Reid, Corey Tonight, and Kathleen Monk. Thanks, guys.